Under the bright lights of the NBA, the name Ben Wallace became an icon of quiet strength and iron will. In modern basketball history, very few players could build a great legacy almost entirely on defense like he did. Wallace was the legendary defensive anchor of the Detroit Pistons in the early 2000s, turning the paint into a near-impenetrable fortress. He won 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards in 2002, 2003, 2005, and 2006, an achievement matched by only a handful of legends in NBA history. Wallace was also selected to the NBA All-Star Game 4 times, made 5 All-NBA teams, and earned 6 spots on the NBA All-Defensive First Team, cementing his status as one of the greatest defenders of all time. The pinnacle of his career came in 2004 when Wallace led Detroit past the star-studded Los Angeles Lakers in the historic 2004 NBA Finals. In that series, he went head-to-head with 2 of the league's biggest offensive legends, Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant. Wallace didn't score a lot of points, but he did something even harder. He disrupted the rhythm of the world's biggest superstars. His blocks, rebounds, and ferocious defense helped Detroit win the NBA championship and turned Wallace into a symbol of fighting spirit. In 2021, his career was forever immortalized when Wallace was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, becoming the first undrafted player in history to enter the Hall of Fame, an almost unbelievable story in professional sports. But behind the awards and the spotlight was a journey full of pain that very few people ever saw. Wallace wasn't born into the world of prestigious basketball academies or expensive training programs. He grew up in a large family in rural Alabama where life revolved around hard labor and scarcity. While many future NBA players got noticed as teenagers, Wallace was practically invisible to scouts. His college path went through small, little-known schools where games were rarely televised and the NBA dream seemed impossibly far away. The biggest pain came in 1996, when Wallace sat waiting through the NBA draft night, hoping his name would be called. But round after round, teams picked other players. That night ended without anyone calling his name. In the world of professional basketball, that almost meant the dream was over. But Wallace refused to accept that fate. He carried the pain of being overlooked into every practice, every game, every jump, every rebound grabbed. Every powerful block was like a response to those who said he wasn't good enough to survive in the NBA. That very pain forged the unbreakable will of Ben Wallace, the man who proved that sometimes the greatest legends are born from dreams the whole world once rejected. If the story of Ben Wallace makes you feel the power of will and perseverance, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the extraordinary journeys of sports legends. Ben Wallace's story didn't begin under the lights of dazzling NBA arenas. It started somewhere completely different, a small, quiet, and poor town called Whitehall in the state of Alabama in the United States. There were no modern sports academies, no famous scouts coming around, and certainly no one imagined that from that red dirt land, one day would emerge one of the greatest defensive players in basketball history. Whitehall back then was a poor rural community where life was tied to the fields, to manual labor, and to large families struggling day by day to survive. In a simple little house, sitting among red dirt roads, Ben Wallace grew up with 10 other siblings. 11 children shared one roof, simple meals, and an undeniable reality. Money in the family was always scarce. There was no abundance, no luxury items, and sometimes even the most basic needs had to be carefully calculated. But if there was one thing that kept that house from collapsing under poverty, it was the woman at its center. Ben's mother, Mrs. Sadie Wallace. She wasn't famous, wasn't an athlete, and wasn't a successful businesswoman. She was just a Southern American mother, strong, tough, and resilient in a way only those who've lived through hardship can understand. Sadie Wallace raised 11 children almost with nothing. She taught her kids that life isn't always fair, but hard work and discipline can help a person stand firm against any difficulty. In that house, kids weren't allowed to be lazy. From a very young age, Ben Wallace and his siblings understood that everyone had to contribute so the family could make it through each day. Mornings didn't start with play or leisure. They started with work. The Wallace children had to go out early to help tend livestock, work the farm fields, and handle necessary household chores. It was a life with few choices, but that very environment taught Ben Wallace lessons no coach could ever teach again: discipline, endurance, and perseverance. Meals in the Wallace family were usually very simple. With so many mouths to feed and so little money, every meal became a careful calculation. There wasn't always enough food for everyone to eat full. Sometimes portions had to be divided small so all could have a share. The older kids learned to give way to the younger ones. In Ben Wallace's memory, that scarcity wasn't just the feeling of hunger. It was also the realization that life wouldn't hand him anything easily. While many other kids across America started playing basketball with brand new sneakers and shiny leather balls, Ben Wallace grew up in a very different world. He didn't have expensive basketball shoes. There was no modern court with clear backboards and glossy wooden floors. All Wallace had were patches of red dirt and some rickety old hoop rigged up somewhere near the house. But that place became his first training court. On those sweltering Alabama afternoons, young Ben shot ball after ball into that old hoop. No audience, no coach, no one recording those shots. But in the silence of the poor countryside, a will was quietly taking shape. Every run across the red dirt, every leap to grab the ball ahead of his siblings, Wallace was unknowingly honing the qualities that would later define his entire career: strength, tenacity, and the ability to fight without ever giving up. Poverty can break many people, but for Ben Wallace, it became a kind of slow-burning fire. It didn't flare up right away, but it burned long enough to forge steel. Those years living in that crowded and deprived house taught him one important thing. If he wanted anything in this life, he would have to take it for himself. No one in Whitehall thought that the skinny boy running on that red dirt court would one day face off against the greatest superstars of the NBA. But maybe it was precisely because no one believed in it that Wallace learned to believe in himself. In that small house full of children's voices and simple meals, a boy was growing up with the heart of a warrior. And many years later, when standing in the giant arenas of the NBA, wearing the Detroit Pistons jersey, Ben Wallace still carried with him the memory of that poorhouse in Alabama, where hunger, hard work, and a mother's love quietly shaped his unbreakable will. The years growing up in that crowded and poor house in Whitehall didn't just teach Ben Wallace how to endure hardship. They also taught him how to fight. Whitehall was a small town in the state of Alabama, where life moved slowly, simply, and sometimes harshly. There weren't many opportunities to change one's fate. Red dirt roads stretched between wide fields, simple houses scattered here and there, and working families living off the farm. For many kids growing up there, the future was often set from a very early age. But for Wallace, there was one thing that opened up a different path in front of him. That was basketball, not the glamorous NBA courts, but just the simple school courts, where old backboards shook every time the ball hit them, and boys raced under the southern sun. Basketball became the only place where Wallace felt he could escape the poverty of everyday life. On the court, he was no longer the boy in a big family who had to share every meal. He was just a player, a fighter, someone always ready to dive into any play. But right from the start, Wallace understood that he wasn't like the other players. Many young stars on the high school team got noticed for their scoring ability. They had beautiful shots, slick dribbling, and dunks that made the crowd cheer. Wallace was different. He wasn't the one scoring the most points. Sometimes he barely scored at all. But that didn't mean he wasn't important. On the contrary, Wallace began to realize he had something not everyone had: strength, speed, and ferocity on defense. He could run without getting tired, he could jump higher than people thought, and most importantly, he was never afraid of contact. In high school games, Wallace was often the one crashing for every rebound, leaping to block shots that seemed out of reach, and making opponents hesitate before driving into the paint. He might not score, but he made sure others couldn't score either. One day during a practice, Wallace's coach said something to him that later became the philosophy of his entire life. The coach looked at Wallace, watched the way the boy dove into every play, and said bluntly, "If you can't score, then stop everyone else from scoring." For many young players, that might have sounded like a reminder of weakness, but for Wallace it was like an awakening. He understood that not everyone has to be the guy dropping 30 points a game to have value. Basketball isn't just offense, it's also defense. And if he could become the best at stopping opponents, he could still make a difference. From that day on, Wallace started seeing basketball in a completely different way. He stopped trying to be the top scorer. Instead, he focused on the things few people paid attention to: defensive positioning, timing his jumps to block shots, using his body to grab rebounds over bigger players. He trained his ability to run tirelessly from one end of the court to the other. He learned to read opponents' movements, anticipate passes, and disrupt plays before they could develop. In school games, Wallace might not have been the first name mentioned on the scoreboard, but those who really understood the game knew that when Wallace was on the court, everything became much harder for the opponents. Easy shots disappeared, drives into the paint turned into painful collisions. But life in Whitehall wasn't always gentle. Basketball was still just a small part of a much bigger reality. Wallace still had to help his family with work, still faced days of scarcity, and still watched those around him accept the limits life imposed. No one from big universities came to scout his games. There were no articles praising Wallace's talent. In the eyes of most of the basketball world, he was still just an unknown kid from a small town. But it was in that anonymity that Wallace developed a weapon that would later earn the respect of the entire NBA: fighting spirit. He didn't play basketball to become famous. He played to prove that he wasn't easy to defeat. Those high school games gradually became Wallace's first lessons in how to survive in a competitive world. He learned that sometimes victory doesn't come from shining brightly, but from doing the hard things others don't want to do. Running one more step, jumping one more time, diving into a scramble that others avoid. Each small action like that slowly built the man Wallace would become. A warrior, someone who never backs down, someone who understands that in life as in basketball, sometimes the best way to survive isn't to be the brightest star, but to be the hardest one to beat. And in that small town of Whitehall, the boy Ben Wallace was learning day by day how to fight a lesson that would stay with him his whole life. From the red dirt courts of Alabama to the fiercest battles of the NBA. After those years learning to fight on the small courts in Whitehall, Ben Wallace entered high school with a dream that few around him truly believed in. For many in that small town, the future of a poor boy was usually pretty clear: work, start a family, and keep living a quiet life, just like the generations before. But Wallace carried a bigger ambition than that. On the athletic fields of Central High School, he didn't just play basketball. He played 3 different sports: basketball, football, and baseball. Each sport helped Wallace become stronger, faster, and tougher. Football built his power and fearlessness in contact. Baseball taught him focus and quick reflexes. But basketball was where Wallace felt his heart truly belonged. There, he could run, jump, and fight every minute on the court. Even so, no matter how hard he tried, Wallace still wasn't the type of player to make scouts pull their cars over outside practice to watch. He wasn't the leading scorer. He didn't have 3-point shots that left crowds in awe. He also didn't have the towering height of the standout centers at prestigious high schools. In the stat sheets, his name rarely appeared at the top. And in the highly competitive world of American high school basketball, that meant one very simple thing. Few people paid attention to him. As his senior year approached, many players in Wallace's class started getting calls from big universities. Recruitment letters came from famous basketball programs. Athletic scholarships opened doors to the NCAA and maybe even farther to the NBA. But for Wallace, the phone at home rarely rang because of basketball. No top college coaches flew to Alabama to meet him. No major scholarships were offered. No scouts sat in the stands just to watch his every move. To most of the basketball world, Ben Wallace was practically invisible. And slowly, the doubts began to creep in. Some said Wallace wasn't tall enough to play center. Others thought his offensive skills were too limited to go far. Someone even told him straight up that professional basketball wasn't the path for him. That statement gradually became a cold, quiet conclusion. Many around him accepted Ben Wallace would never play in the NBA. It wasn't a loud mockery. It was more like a silent but cruel judgment, an assertion that his dream was simply too big for reality. For a young man who grew up in poverty, words like that could easily become the end. Wallace understood that if he wanted to keep chasing the dream, the road ahead would be much harder than for other players. No big scholarships, no guarantees, no one promising him a chance. But instead of giving up, Wallace chose to do what he had learned as a boy in Whitehall: fight. He kept training, kept playing, kept diving into every play as if each game was his last shot. There were days Wallace wondered if all that effort would really lead him anywhere. There were nights he thought about his family, about his mother, about the years working on the farm, and wondered if he was chasing a dream too far out of reach. But every time he stepped onto the court, the doubts seemed to vanish. The ball bounced on the floor, the squeak of sneakers on the court, and Wallace found his reason to keep going again. It was during that high school period that the first real pain in Wallace's journey began to take shape. Not a huge failure or a tragic event, but the feeling of being overlooked, being seen as not good enough, being viewed as a player whose future might stop somewhere before ever reaching the NBA. But sometimes those very doubts become the most powerful fuel. Every time someone said he couldn't do it, Wallace remembered it. Every time an opportunity passed without anyone noticing him, he trained even harder, not to prove it to the whole world right away, but to prove to himself that the dream was still worth pursuing. And while many around him gradually forgot the name Ben Wallace, the boy from Whitehall kept fighting in silence, carrying a small but stubborn belief that one day that seemingly non-existent path would lead him to a place no one ever thought he could reach. After those high school years full of effort but almost unnoticed by anyone, Ben Wallace stepped into the next phase of his life with a winding road that few NBA players ever had to take. While other high school basketball stars got scholarships from big universities and entered the prestigious NCAA Division I programs, Wallace had to choose a different path: the detour of the overlooked. He began that journey at Cuyahoga Community College in Cleveland. That wasn't a place where NBA scouts usually hung around. There were no nationally televised games, no thousands of fans filling the stands. The games there happened quietly, almost invisible to the rest of the basketball world. But for Wallace, it wasn't a dead end. It was an opportunity, a small chance to keep chasing the dream that so many had told him he should abandon. At Cuyahoga Community College, Wallace started developing the skills that would later define his entire career. He wasn't the leading scorer on the team, but in every game, Wallace did the things many other players didn't want to do. He crashed for every rebound. He leaped to block every shot. He ran tirelessly from one end of the court to the other, ready to collide with anyone in his way. Gradually, The people watching basketball there began to notice that Wallace had something very special, a natural defensive instinct. He could read an opponent's movements before they even attempted a shot. He could jump quicker than people expected, and most importantly, he was never afraid of contact. Every play felt like a small battle, and Wallace always entered that battle with every ounce of his energy. After some time at Cuyahoga, Wallace continued his journey at Virginia Union University, a Division II school. Once again, it wasn't the big stage of American college basketball. Division II had less spotlight, less media coverage, and fewer chances to get noticed. Games rarely appeared on television. No major sports journalists wrote about the players there, and almost no NBA scouts filled the stands looking for new talent. But it was in that low-light environment that Wallace began to shine in his own way. He became a true rebounding machine. Game after game, Wallace dominated the paint with astonishing ferocity. No matter how much taller or heavier the opponents were, Wallace still dove in to fight for the ball with an almost instinctive aggression. Balls that bounced off the rim usually ended up in his hands, and when opponents tried to shoot close to the basket, Wallace was often the one leaping up to block the shot before it could even reach the backboard. Before long, Wallace became one of the most feared defensive players in Division II. His stats started turning heads. Hundreds of rebounds, hundreds of blocks, and games where opponents could barely score in the paint. In the eyes of the coaches and teammates at Virginia Union, Wallace wasn't just a good player. He was the heart of the team, but no matter how impressive those accomplishments were, one painful reality remained unchanged. Most of the basketball world still didn't know who he was. Division II was simply too far from the bright lights of NCAA Division I and way off the NBA's radar. Sometimes, on those long bus rides after games, Wallace would sit quietly staring out the window and wonder if this path was really going to lead him to the NBA. He had done everything he could. He trained harder than most. He played with an intensity few players matched. But with each passing year, the NBA dream still felt so distant. Young stars from big universities appeared on national television, got mentioned in sports highlights, and became familiar names to scouts. Meanwhile, Wallace was still playing in small gyms with just a few hundred fans in the stands. It was a strange feeling knowing he was getting better every day, but the outside world seemed completely unaware of it. Even so, Wallace never let that invisibility stop him. Instead of waiting for attention, he kept doing what he did best, fighting under the basket. Every rebound became a statement that he deserved a shot. Every block felt like a rebuttal to those who once said he wasn't good enough for the highest level. Wallace understood that if the NBA couldn't see him, he would have to play well enough to make them unable to keep ignoring him. But at that point, he still didn't know the road ahead would be even more painful. Because even after becoming a rebounding machine and a defensive wall in Division II, it still wasn't enough to catch the NBA's eye. And a bigger challenge was waiting for him up ahead one night, when his dream would seem completely extinguished. For many young players, the path from college basketball to the NBA is marked by one special moment: draft night, when their name is called in front of millions and the door to the world's biggest league officially opens. But for Ben Wallace, that moment became one of the most painful memories of his life. In 1996, after those hard-fought seasons at Virginia Union University, Wallace carried a small but burning hope that somehow an NBA team would see what he could do on the court. He knew he wasn't a big name, not a star from a major basketball program, but he still believed his tireless rebounding, ferocious blocks, and never-give-up fighting spirit would catch someone's attention. And so Wallace sat waiting for the 1996 NBA draft to unfold. It was a long evening. On stage, names were called one after another. Young players walked up, shook hands, put on their new team's hat, and smiled for the cameras. Each time a name was announced, Wallace quietly looked up at the screen, hoping the next one would be his. But then the first round passed. His name didn't appear. The second round began. The last chances were slipping away. Wallace still sat there, waiting, and then the final picks were announced one by one. When the last name was read, the truth became clear and cold. No one selected Ben Wallace. Not a single team. Not a single team. Not a single guaranteed opportunity. That moment felt like the entire basketball world was telling him one thing: you're not good enough. In the brutal world of professional sports, an undrafted player usually has only one outcome: the NBA dream ends before it truly begins. Many in that position would have chosen to quit. After all, Wallace had already traveled a longer road than most players. He didn't come from prestigious universities. He had no endorsement deals or media attention, and now even the NBA seemed to have turned its back on him. In the silent hours after draft night, Wallace had to face the question anyone in that situation would ask themselves: was all this effort worth it? Did the dream he had chased since those red dirt courts in Alabama even really exist? That was the moment when many sports dreams die. But for Wallace, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of an even greater challenge. Instead of accepting defeat, Wallace carried the pain of that night like fuel. He understood that if no team picked him, he would have to find his own way into the NBA. Not with promises, but with actions. Not with fame, but with persistence. Wallace kept training, kept running, kept jumping, kept doing what he had done his whole life, fighting. He knew the road ahead would be much harder. No guaranteed contract, no secure spot on a roster, just tiny opportunities he would have to seize at any cost. But Wallace had never been afraid of tough roads. The boy who grew up in poverty in Whitehall had learned very early that life rarely gives you anything for free. You have to take it. So when many thought Ben Wallace's dream had died on draft night in 1996, he began preparing for the next chapter of his life, a chapter where he would prove to the whole world that they were wrong. And in silence, without the spotlight, Wallace started stepping into his biggest battle, fighting to survive in the NBA, a league that, from the very beginning, had said he didn't belong there. After that draft night in 1996, when the dream seemed to die quietly in the silence of the entire basketball world, Ben Wallace still didn't give up. Not long after, one final small door cracked open. It wasn't a big contract, not a media welcome, but just a fragile opportunity from the team then known as the Washington Bullets. For Wallace, that chance was like a life raft in the middle of the ocean. But even after stepping into the NBA, his real fight was only just beginning. Wallace didn't arrive as an expected star. He wasn't a high draft pick. He wasn't even a name fans recognized. In the Bullets' locker room, he was just a young player few paid attention to, someone trying to prove he deserved to exist in the world's toughest league. Those first days in the NBA were nothing like the dreams Wallace had once imagined. There was no spotlight of glory, no games where he shone brightly. Instead, there were scarce minutes on the court, grueling practices, and the feeling that just one small mistake could make his only chance vanish. Wallace mostly sat on the bench, watching games unfold from the sidelines. When he did get into the game, his playing time usually lasted just a few short minutes. In a league where players were judged by points and flashy offense, Wallace wasn't a scorer. The only thing he could do was defend, grab rebounds, and bring energy to the team when given the opportunity. But in the NBA, players who were only good at defense rarely got noticed. So many believed Wallace was just a temporary name, a player who would quickly disappear from the league once the team found a better option. Those doubts weren't something Wallace didn't hear. In the fast-moving world of the NBA, everything happened quickly. Young players kept emerging, and teams were always ready to replace anyone who didn't meet expectations. Each season, dozens of players had to leave the league because they couldn't hold their spot. Wallace understood he was standing on that fragile edge. Every game, every practice felt like a test. If he didn't fight hard enough, if he didn't prove his worth, the NBA door could slam shut forever. But Wallace had long been used to being doubted. From his days in Whitehall, from his years in Division II, he had always had to fight to be seen. So instead of complaining about limited playing time, Wallace chose to do the one thing he knew: work harder than anyone else. In practices, he was the one crashing for the ball the hardest. He jumped higher, ran faster, and defended more fiercely. Coaches might not call his name much in games, but in the gym, Wallace was always the one who made people take notice. Even so, his path remained full of uncertainty. After some time with Washington, Wallace faced another turning point. He was traded to the Orlando Magic. For many players, a trade could mean a fresh start. But for Wallace, it also carried new worries. Because every time he changed teams, his spot had to be proven all over again. Nothing guaranteed more playing time. Nothing guaranteed trust. Once again, Wallace walked into a new team's locker room as virtually an unknown name. At Orlando, things remained as fragile as before. Wallace still wasn't the center of the team. He was still a bench player, still fighting for every minute on the court to keep his place. Games passed, and Wallace kept doing what few noticed: battling for rebounds, blocking shots, defending relentlessly. But in a league where the spotlight usually shone on the top scorers, his quiet contributions still weren't enough to turn him into a star. There were times Wallace wondered if he truly belonged in the NBA. He had come a long way from Alabama, from those red dirt courts to the giant arenas of the professional league. But even after arriving here, his position remained uncertain. Just one bad season, one injury, or one coaching decision could end everything. Many believed Wallace was just prolonging an impossible journey. They thought sooner or later he would vanish from the NBA like hundreds of players before him. But there was one thing the doubters didn't understand. Ben Wallace had never feared tough roads. He had lived his entire life in doubt and deprivation. So when the NBA seemed to want him gone, Wallace kept fighting. And while many thought his career was fading into obscurity, an unexpected turning point waited ahead, a trade that no one at the time thought was significant, but one that would later completely change Ben Wallace's life and the history of a team called the Detroit Pistons. Many years later, when looking back on his entire journey, Ben Wallace often said his life changed in one moment almost no one noticed. Not a game-winning shot, not a major award, but a quiet trade in the summer of 2020, a deal that at the time most NBA fans didn't even remember. For Wallace, it was the moment that saved his entire career. After years of struggling just to survive in the league, when his spot was still shaky and his future still unclear, fate brought him to a completely new place. And that place was the Detroit Pistons. That summer, Wallace's team at the time, the Orlando Magic, faced a big decision. They wanted to rebuild their roster and chase a big star. Meanwhile, Detroit was looking to change its future. The centerpiece of the trade was a famous name, Grant Hill, the Pistons' brightest star at the time. Hill was one of the NBA's most complete players, an icon in Detroit, and a face the entire league knew. When the trade was announced, most people only talked about Grant Hill. Headlines, sports shows, everything focused on how Orlando had landed a superstar. The names going the other way, including Ben Wallace, were barely mentioned. To many, Wallace was just a side piece in a big deal, a decent defensive player thrown in to complete the transaction. No one at the time thought Detroit had just acquired one of the greatest defensive players in NBA history. When Wallace arrived in Detroit, he wasn't welcomed like a star. No big press conference, no media hype. To the Pistons, he was just a strong player with good rebounding and solid defense. But inside Wallace, the fire that had burned for years finally had a chance to blaze. For the first time in his career, he felt he could have a real role on a team. Detroit back then wasn't the flashiest team in the NBA. They didn't have dazzling offensive superstars like many others, but they had a clear philosophy: defense, discipline, and fighting spirit, and it was in that system that Wallace began to find his true place. Those first days in Detroit still weren't easy. Wallace still had to prove himself. But this time, coaches started noticing what so many before had overlooked. On the court, Wallace brought a different energy. He didn't just grab rebounds. He fought for every ball. He dove into collisions many other players avoided. Whenever an opponent drove into the paint, Wallace appeared like a wall. His powerful blocks made the home crowd jump to their feet. His relentless defense energized the entire team. Gradually, Wallace was no longer just a bench player. He became the heart of the Pistons' defense. Detroit back then was also searching for a new identity. After years without major success, the team needed someone who could change the entire group's fighting spirit. And Wallace, the man who had been overlooked on draft night, who had to fight just to survive in the NBA, became the perfect fit. He played with a rare ferocity. Every rebound felt like a battle. Every block was a declaration that Detroit would not back down against any opponent. Pistons fans started to notice something special about Wallace. They loved the way he fought. They loved his massive afro, his stone-cold face, and his fearless spirit. Gradually, the name Ben Wallace was no longer that of an unknown player. The 2000 trade was initially seen as one centered around Grant Hill. But over time, history rewrote that story in a completely different way. While Hill struggled with injuries in Orlando, in Detroit, Wallace was steadily becoming a terrifying defensive force. His rebounds came in such numbers that opponents grew discouraged. His blocks turned the paint into forbidden territory. And most importantly, he brought the Pistons a fighting spirit the team had been missing for years. For Wallace, Detroit wasn't just a new team. It felt like a second chance life had given him. After all those years of doubt, being overlooked, and being told he wasn't good enough, he finally had a place to prove himself. And he did it the only way he knew how, through defense, through strength, and through an unbreakable will. From an undrafted player, Wallace began the journey of becoming the heart of the Detroit Pistons. But even after finding his place on the team, a major challenge still lay ahead. Because to become a true legend, Wallace didn't just need to survive in the NBA. He needed to do what few believed a defensive player like him could: dominate the league. And it was in Detroit that story was about to begin. After finally finding a real opportunity with the Detroit Pistons, Ben Wallace's life stepped into a completely different chapter. His early years in Detroit weren't an immediate explosion, but game by game, season by season, Wallace gradually built something very few players in NBA history had ever achieved: a reputation made entirely through defense. In a league where stars were usually celebrated for beautiful three-pointers or explosive scoring, Wallace rose through the things few paid attention to: powerful rebounds, ferocious blocks, and the ability to frustrate even the biggest defensive superstars when they faced him. Gradually, the Pistons began building their entire defensive system around Wallace. He wasn't just a player in the lineup, he became the heart of the defense. In the early 2000s, Detroit slowly formed a roster that could change their history. Alongside Wallace were disciplined and smart players. Chauncey Billups controlled the game's tempo with rare calm. Richard Hamilton moved relentlessly to score. Tayshaun Prince brought terrifying length on defense. And later, when Rasheed Wallace joined the team, Detroit became nearly an impenetrable fortress. But no matter how many important names were on the roster, the center of it all remained Ben Wallace. He didn't need to score 30 points to make an impact. Just standing in the paint, Wallace forced opponents to change how they played. Offensive players started hesitating before driving into the restricted area. Easy layups suddenly became dangerous when Wallace was ready to leap and block the shot. Over time, Detroit became one of the most feared defensive teams in the entire NBA. Pistons games often didn't have high scores, but that didn't matter to them. They won by making opponents unable to score. and Wallace was the steel wall at the center of that system. Game after game, he grabbed rebounds like every ball was a matter of life and death. Every block made the entire arena erupt. Detroit fans began calling him by a name full of respect, Big Ben, not because he scored a lot of points, but because he was the protector of the entire city of Detroit on the court. Wallace's contributions eventually earned recognition across the league. He began receiving prestigious defensive awards. Year after year, Wallace was repeatedly honored as the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year. In total, he won the award 4 times, an extremely rare feat for any player. Those awards weren't just personal honors. They were proof that a player didn't need to score heavily to become a star. Wallace proved that defense could change entire games. But even after achieving such great accomplishments, Wallace was often underrated. In the NBA, high-scoring players usually got the biggest attention. They appeared on magazine covers. They were praised on television. Wallace, despite dominating the paint, was often seen as an incomplete player. Many only looked at the scoring stats and said he wasn't good enough to rank alongside other superstars. Wallace didn't score 25 points a game. He didn't have flashy offensive plays. So even as the cornerstone of one of the NBA's strongest defenses, he still had to hear the doubts. That sometimes hurt Wallace, because he had fought his entire life to be recognized. From a poor boy in Alabama, from a Division II player, from an undrafted prospect, Wallace had overcome countless barriers to reach this point. But even standing at the peak of NBA defense, some still said he wasn't elite enough. However, Wallace didn't let those words stop him. He understood that his value wasn't in the points he scored. His value was in preventing opponents from scoring. And every time he stepped onto the court, Wallace still played with the same spirit he had carried from his days in Alabama, fighting for every ball, for every defensive play, for every team win. Under Wallace's leadership and the disciplined defensive system, the Detroit Pistons gradually became a formidable force in the East. Teams started dreading matchups against them, not because Detroit had many offensive superstars, but because they knew scoring against the Pistons was a nightmare. And at the center of that nightmare was always Ben Wallace, the man with the massive afro and the cold stare. But even though Detroit had become a strong team, a major challenge still waited ahead, because to prove they were truly a great team, the Pistons would have to face one of the strongest teams in NBA history. A team full of superstars, led by offensive legends. And it was in that battle that Ben Wallace would face a true giant of basketball, Shaquille O'Neal. And that matchup would change the history of the Detroit Pistons forever. After many seasons building a defensive identity with the Detroit Pistons, the name Ben Wallace was no longer just that of an underrated player. He had become the centerpiece of a team steadily entering its peak era. But to truly earn recognition in the NBA, Detroit had to face the biggest challenge, battling teams with the greatest offensive superstars of the era. And for Wallace, those weren't just games, they were wars. Throughout the early 2000s, the NBA was dominated by scoring stars. Names like Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, and Kevin Garnett were players who could change games single-handedly with their offensive ability. They were tall, strong, and nearly unstoppable when driving to the basket. Especially Shaquille O'Neal, the most dominant center in the NBA at the time. Shaq was taller, heavier, and stronger than almost every opponent he faced. When Shaq got the ball near the rim, many teams had almost no way to stop him. But Detroit had someone ready to stand up to that giant. And that someone was Ben Wallace. When the Pistons faced teams with Shaq, all eyes turned to the paint, because there unfolded an almost unimaginable matchup. A player around 6'9" and over 240 pounds, going against a giant weighing more than 340 pounds. The nearly 100-pound difference made many believe Wallace couldn't hold his ground. But Wallace never played by comparing body sizes. He played with will. Every time Shaq got the ball and tried to back down to the rim, Wallace used every ounce of his strength to hold position. He resisted those monstrous pushes, leaped to contest shots, and fought as if it were the last game of his life. There were collisions so hard both men hit the floor. There were moments Wallace got shoved back a few steps. But most importantly, he never backed down. Those matchups between Detroit and teams with Shaq gradually became symbols of a clash between two basketball philosophies. One side was the terrifying offensive power of superstars. The other was the disciplined defensive system and fighting spirit of the Pistons. Wallace didn't just try to stop Shaq from scoring. He tried to make Shaq work hard for every shot. Every time Shaq had to turn more, every time he had to shoot from a tougher angle, Detroit got one step closer to victory. Wallace understood he didn't need to block every shot. He just needed to make the opponent feel that every drive into his area was a battle. Those very games turned Wallace into an icon. Detroit fans started seeing him not just as a great defensive player, but as a warrior. His massive afro became a familiar sight in arenas. When Wallace raised his arms after a block or a powerful rebound, the entire Pistons crowd seemed to explode. For the city of Detroit, a city of workers, of people who had to labor hard just to survive, Wallace represented their spirit. He wasn't a flashy player. He was a laborer on the court, someone willing to do the hardest things to help his team win. During those years, Wallace didn't just face Shaq. He had to battle many of the NBA's biggest centers. Games against Tim Duncan or Kevin Garnett were also grueling tests. But each matchup only made Wallace's reputation grow larger. No matter how strong the opponent, Wallace always stepped onto the court with the same attitude, fearless. He could get pushed back. He could get fouled. But he would never accept an easy defeat. Those battles slowly changed how people viewed Wallace. At first, he was seen only as a solid defensive player. But after years of going toe-to-toe with the league's biggest superstars, Wallace began to be mentioned as one of the greatest defensive centers in history. He proved that in basketball, brute strength doesn't always win. Will, discipline, and endurance can sometimes be even more intimidating than muscle. For Wallace, every game against the NBA's giants felt like a reminder of his own journey. He had once been a poor boy in Alabama. He had once been a Division II player. He had once been an Undrafted T player. He had once been undrafted. And now, he stood in the middle of the NBA, going head-to-head with the world's biggest superstars. But even after achieving all that, Wallace still hadn't reached his true peak because the biggest challenge still waited ahead: an NBA Finals. A battle against the strongest team of the era, where Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant ruled the league. And it was in that battle that Ben Wallace and the Detroit Pistons would write one of the greatest stories in basketball history. After years of fighting in silence, after countless battles with the giants of the NBA, Ben Wallace's journey finally led him to the biggest stage in world basketball. In 2024, the Detroit Pistons entered the 2024 NBA Finals. But right from the start, most of the basketball world believed the outcome was all but decided, because on the other side of the court stood one of the most star-studded lineups in NBA history, the Los Angeles Lakers. That wasn't just a strong team. It was a team that embodied power and glory. They had Kobe Bryant, one of the league's most fearsome scorers. They had Shaquille O'Neal, the dominant center, for years. And to bolster their strength even more, the Lakers also had two other legends, Karl Malone and Gary Payton. The media called that lineup a super team. Many experts even predicted the finals series would end quickly. Detroit was seen as the underdog, a hard-working group, but not talented enough to beat Los Angeles' star-studded roster. To many, the Pistons even reaching the finals was already a surprise. But for Wallace and his teammates, they didn't enter that series to be spectators. They entered to fight. Right from Game 1, the Pistons shocked the entire NBA. Detroit didn't play like an underdog. They defended with terrifying intensity. Every Lakers possession faced pressure. Kobe Bryant could no longer easily find open looks. Shaquille O'Neal could no longer catch the ball in the post without resistance. And at the center of it all stood Ben Wallace. Every time Shaq got the ball, Wallace charged right at him. Though smaller by nearly 100 pounds, he still held firm against those monstrous collisions. He used every bit of his strength and technique to force Shaq into tougher shots. There were plays where Wallace got shoved back, but he immediately sprang up to fight for the rebound. There were blocks that shook the entire Detroit crowd. Wallace didn't just defend. He instilled in the whole team the spirit that they weren't afraid. As the series continued, what seemed impossible began to become reality. Detroit wasn't just competing with the Lakers. They were controlling the series. The Pistons' defensive system made Los Angeles' star-studded lineup look disjointed. The Lakers' familiar plays were broken by Detroit's discipline. Chauncey Billups ran the game with astonishing calm. Richard Hamilton kept scoring off relentless off-ball movement. Tayshaun Prince used his long arms to disrupt attacks. Rasheed Wallace brought power and boldness, but the heart of it all remained Ben Wallace, the guardian of the paint, like a warrior defending the final fortress. Game after game, the Pistons kept shocking the world. The Lakers, the team expected to dominate, started falling into passivity. Detroit won game after game. And then the decisive moment arrived. When the Pistons claimed victory in the fourth game of the series, the final tally was 4-1. The Detroit Pistons became NBA champions. That wasn't just a win. It was one of the biggest upsets in NBA history. A team without offensive superstars had defeated a lineup full of legends. A collective built on defense, discipline, and teamwork had beaten the power of fame and individual talent. When the final buzzer sounded, the Pistons players embraced on the court. Detroit fans celebrated as if the entire city had been set free. And amid those cheers, the image of Ben Wallace standing under the basket became an icon. Not because he scored the most points, not because he was an offensive star, but because he was the soul of that victory. For Wallace, that moment carried deeper meaning than anyone could understand. He remembered the poor boy in Alabama. He remembered the years playing in Division II. He remembered draft night in 1996 when no one called his name. All that pain, all those doubts, seemed to converge in this one moment. The man once told he wasn't good enough to play in the NBA now stood at the pinnacle of the league. And under the lights of the trophy presentation, one truth became clear to the whole world. Sometimes the greatest thing in sports isn't dazzling offensive talent. Sometimes the greatest thing is a will that never accepts defeat. But even after achieving the greatest glory of his career, Ben Wallace's story wasn't over. Because after the peak of victory, his life still held other challenges, years when the spotlight slowly faded, and the Warrior had to face a difficult question. How does a defensive legend live when the battles on the court come to an end? After the glorious night of the 2004 NBA Championship, Ben Wallace and the Detroit Pistons entered the new season as defending champions. The entire league looked at them with newfound respect. Detroit was no longer the overlooked team. They were the kings of the NBA, the team that had beaten the Los Angeles Lakers and the biggest superstars of the era. But just months after that peak, an event occurred that shook the entire league. A night later known by the infamous name Malice at the Palace. A night when basketball was no longer just basketball. A chaotic night the NBA would never forget. In November 2004, the Pistons faced the Indiana Pacers in a regular season game. The atmosphere inside the Palace of Auburn Hills was tense from the start. The Pacers were one of the strongest teams in the East and a direct rival to Detroit. The game was intense with plenty of hard collisions. Matchups between these two teams were always highly physical, and the players knew every play could explode into conflict. As the game neared its end, the Pacers held a comfortable lead. Less than a minute remained on the clock. For many, the game was all but over. But then a small moment ignited the storm. When Wallace caught the ball and drove to the rim, Ron Artest committed a very hard foul to stop him from scoring. The foul wasn't unusual in basketball, but in that moment, it was like the final drop that overflowed the cup. Wallace, who always played with intense emotion, reacted immediately. He stood up and shoved Artest. The two players went at each other, and teammates quickly rushed in to separate them. For a few seconds, it seemed everything would be contained. The referees tried to pull the players apart. The game seemed about to return to normal. But then, something no one expected happened. From the stands, a fan threw a cup onto the court. The cup flew through the air and hit Artest. In that instant, the boundary between the court and the stands disappeared. Artest charged into the stands to confront the person who threw it. And in just a few short seconds, chaos erupted. Pacers and Pistons players rushed into the stands. Fans poured onto the court. Punches, shouts, and panic spread throughout the arena. What began as a foul in a basketball game turned into one of the worst riots in American sports history. Ben Wallace, who had unintentionally become the initial focal point of the incident, was also swept into the chaos. Players tried to protect each other, tried to leave the court while fans threw objects from the stands. The game was called off. The arena became a scene of unprecedented disorder in the NBA. When everything finally settled, the consequences of that night began to emerge. Images of the brawl spread across television channels. Sports news and national broadcasts repeatedly replayed scenes of players fighting with fans. For the NBA, it was a public relations nightmare. The league, which had been trying to build a professional and global image, suddenly faced one of the biggest scandals in its history. After the investigation, the NBA handed down severe punishments. Ron Artest was suspended for the remainder of the season, one of the harshest penalties in NBA history. Many other players were also banned from playing. Ben Wallace, though he didn't climb into the stands, was suspended for his role in the initial altercation. For Wallace, it was a painful moment. He had just experienced the peak of his career with the NBA championship, but just months later, his name appeared across the news because of a riot. The Malice at the Palace incident changed the NBA forever. The league implemented many new security regulations. The distance between fans and the court was controlled much more strictly. Rules about player conduct also became stricter. The NBA understood they could not let a night like that happen again. For Ben Wallace, that night also left a deep mark on his career. Wallace had always been an emotional player, a warrior on the court. But the event reminded him that sometimes just one moment of losing control can change how the whole world sees you. From being a defensive icon for Detroit, Wallace suddenly found himself in the middle of one of the biggest scandals in NBA history. But just like so many other challenges in his life, Wallace didn't let that event define who he was. He kept playing, kept leading the Pistons with his defensive spirit and unbreakable will. Because, for Wallace, life was always a series of battles, and he had learned very early that even after the darkest nights, a warrior still has to get up and keep moving forward. After the storm known as Malice at the Palace, Ben Wallace's career continued. He remained the defensive heart of the Detroit Pistons for many more seasons, but even though Wallace's will stayed as strong as ever, time the one opponent no athlete can defeat began to speak quietly. The years of playing at terrifying intensity, the collisions under the basket with the NBA's biggest centers, the endless leaps for rebounds, all of it gradually left its marks on his body. Playing basketball as a defensive center is a constant physical war, and Wallace had fought in that war for many years. Every game brought dozens of collisions. Every rebound was a struggle against players over 265 pounds. During his peak years, Wallace almost never backs down from any opponent. But when he entered his 30s, his body started responding differently. The pain after games lasted longer. Mornings waking up became harder. His knees, back, and shoulders parts that had endured thousands of impacts began, reminding him that no one can fight forever. In 2006, Wallace left Detroit and signed with the Chicago Bulls. That was a new chapter in his career. Chicago hoped Wallace would bring his defensive spirit and championship experience to their young team. In his early seasons with the Bulls, Wallace still showed flashes of the true warrior he was. He still grabbed rebounds, still blocked shots, and still energized the whole team. But those who had followed him from his Detroit days began to notice the difference. Wallace was still smart and fierce, but his steps were a little slower. His jumps weren't as high as before. The battles that once came instinctively now required more effort. For Wallace, that wasn't easy to accept. His entire life, he had built his reputation on strength and endurance. He was the man who could stand firm against giants like Shaquille O'Neal. He was the defensive wall that made opponents afraid. But now, he began to feel a truth every athlete eventually faces. The human body has limits. After his time in Chicago, Wallace continued his journey with the Cleveland Cavaliers. In Cleveland, he became a veteran in the locker room, an experienced player helping the team maintain defensive discipline. Wallace was no longer the center of the system like in his Detroit days, but his presence still brought value. Young players looked to Wallace as a symbol of hard work and fighting spirit. However, injuries and age made playing increasingly difficult. His minutes on the court dwindled. The games he had to sit out due to soreness increased. For a warrior like Wallace, the moment he realized he wasn't the player he once was felt painful. Not because he feared failure. Wallace had grown used to doubt his whole life. What was hard to accept was the feeling that his body no longer matched his will. In his mind, he still wanted to crash for every ball like in his peak years, but sometimes the body just wouldn't allow it. And so, like every other sports legend, Wallace entered the final phase of his career. He still took the court, still fought. But now every game felt like a slow goodbye to the life he had known for more than a decade. Fans still remembered the image of his massive afro and those powerful blocks. But they also began to realize that the era of Big Ben was quietly coming to a close. However, if there was one thing that never changed about Ben Wallace, it was his spirit. Even as his body slowed, even as his minutes decreased, Wallace still stepped onto the court with the same attitude he had carried from his days in Alabama: fight with everything he had. Because for Wallace, basketball had never been just a game. It was the story of his entire life. A life built from poverty, from doubt, and from battles that were never easy. And even as his body grew tired, the heart of that warrior never truly stopped. After those final years on the court, when Ben Wallace's body began to slow and the NBA lights gradually dimmed behind him, many wondered if history had truly been fair to Wallace. Because if you looked only at raw stats, Wallace wasn't the type of player the NBA usually celebrates. He didn't score 20 or 30 points a game. He wasn't on the scoring leaderboards. He was even an undrafted player in the NBA draft, a fact that in the professional basketball world usually meant a very short career. But Wallace's story never followed the usual rules, and in 2021, history finally spoke. That year, Wallace received the news he had waited for over many years. He was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. For many great players, the Hall of Fame is the natural endpoint of a storied career. But for Wallace, this moment carried far deeper meaning, because when his name was called among the honorees, Wallace became the first undrafted player in NBA history to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. That wasn't just a personal honor. It was like a long overdue apology from basketball history. Remember Wallace's journey, the poor boy who grew up in Whitehall, Alabama, in a large family full of hardship and scarcity. a high school player overlooked by big universities, a Division II college kid with almost no television lights, a young man sitting through the 1996 NBA draft night while no one called his name. Many in that situation would have faded from the NBA dream. But Wallace chose a different path. He entered the league through the smallest door, fighting for every minute on the court and every opportunity to survive. Throughout his career, Wallace did what few thought was possible. He became the greatest defensive wall of his era. He won Defensive Player of the Year 4 times, standing alongside the biggest defensive legends in NBA history. He led the Detroit Pistons to the championship in 2004, defeating the star-studded Los Angeles Lakers lineup. He made towering centers like Shaquille O'Neal work incredibly hard for every shot. And he did all of it with almost no reliance on scoring ability. But for many years after retirement, Wallace still had to wait for basketball's highest recognition. Partly because his playing style wasn't flashy, partly because the NBA often celebrates scorers more than those who prevent points. But those who truly understand basketball know that great teams always need someone like Ben Wallace, someone willing to do the hardest jobs that few others want to do. When Wallace stood on the Hall of Fame stage in 2021, that moment didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to every underrated player, the undrafted ones, the ones told they weren't good enough. Wallace didn't need to say much. Just standing there was a powerful message. For Detroit fans, it was an emotional moment. They remembered the image of his massive afro, those ferocious blocks, and Big Ben's never-back-down fighting spirit. Wallace wasn't a perfect player. He had controversies, tough times in his career, but he was always a symbol of resilience. And when the Hall of Fame plaque with Ben Wallace's name was unveiled, it felt like closing a circle in history. The poor boy from Alabama, the one the entire basketball world overlooked on draft night, now placed in the pantheon of legends. A journey that began in silence and doubt, ultimately ending in eternal honor. But perhaps the most beautiful thing in that story isn't the Hall of Fame honor itself. The most beautiful thing is the meaning Wallace brought to the world of sports. Because his journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest legends aren't the ones chosen from the start. Sometimes they're the ones the whole world once thought would never belong there. After that historic moment when Ben Wallace was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, many believed his story had finally come to a complete and perfect close. But if you look deeper into that journey, you realize that Ben Wallace's true legacy was never just in the awards, the trophies, or the golden plaques in basketball museums. His real legacy lies in something else. A man who refused to disappear from a world that repeatedly told him he didn't belong there. Wallace wasn't the type of superstar marketing campaigns love. He didn't score 30 points a game. He wasn't the guy on magazine covers for buzzer beaters. Throughout his career, he rarely became the center of flashy highlight reels. But that's exactly what made Wallace's story so special. Because he embodied a different kind of greatness. A greatness built from quiet labor, from persistence, and from an unyielding will. Wallace was a survivor of poverty. The boy who grew up in a small house in Alabama with 10 siblings, where every meal had to be shared and every day was a fight for survival. He was a survivor of doubt, from coaches who thought he wasn't good enough, from NBA scouts who believed he was too small to play center, from that 1996 NBA draft night when his name was never called. And he was also a survivor of the NBA's own brutality league, where hundreds of talented players are replaced every year. Wallace didn't just survive in that league. He changed it. He proved that defense can be an art form. He proved that a player doesn't need to score a lot to become the soul of a team. And most importantly, he proved that human will can sometimes be stronger than every limit society tries to impose. When looking back on those years in Detroit, fans don't just remember the 2004 championship. They remember the blocks that shook entire arenas. They remember the massive afro flying every time Wallace leaped for a board. They remember the cold stare of a man always ready to battle any opponent. Even the towering centers like Shaquille O'Neal. Wallace didn't need to talk much. He let his actions speak for everything, and that powerful silence is what made him an icon. But perhaps what is most admirable about Wallace isn't the wins. It's how he faced failure. Throughout his life, Wallace was overlooked time and again, not drafted, not highly regarded, not seen as a star. But every time he returned to the court with the same attitude: work harder, fight fiercer, and prove through action that the doubts were wrong. That's why Wallace's story isn't just about basketball. It's a story about dignity, about resilience, about the strength of a man who refused to accept the destiny others wrote for him. When the lights of his NBA career faded and time passed on, Wallace may not appear on weekly television shows anymore. He no longer stands under the bright glare of finals games, but his legacy endures, alive in every young player learning to defend, learning to fight for every rebound, learning to believe that even the most underrated can write history. And that's why Ben Wallace will never fade from basketball's story. Because some legends are born with natural talent, but Ben Wallace became a legend because he refused to disappear. The story of Ben Wallace isn't just the journey of a basketball player, it's also a mirror that evokes both heartache and admiration. When looking back on his life, what hurts the most isn't the losses or the injuries, but the incredibly rough road he had to travel before the world finally acknowledged his talent. From the boy who grew up in a poorhouse in Whitehall, Alabama with 11 siblings, where meals sometimes weren't enough, and the basketball court was just red dirt with a rickety old hoop, Wallace had to learn how to fight life from a very young age. That pain continued when he entered professional basketball. On the night of the 1996 NBA draft, when his name wasn't called even once, the whole world seemed to tell him the NBA dream was over. But it was precisely from that cruel moment that Wallace turned the world's silence into fuel to prove his worth. The years as a bench player in Washington and then being traded to Orlando felt like just a short chapter before he would vanish from the league. Yet when he arrived in Detroit, Wallace transformed himself into the defensive heart of the team, winning 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards and helping the Pistons pull off one of the greatest upsets in history by defeating the star-studded Los Angeles Lakers in the 2004 NBA Finals. That journey delivers a profound lesson for American society today. A person's value isn't always recognized immediately, and those who are the most underrated are sometimes the strongest ones. In a country where so many young people also grow up in tough circumstances, Ben Wallace's story reminds us that starting point doesn't determine the future. What determines the future is the will to get back up after every rejection, just as Wallace did throughout his entire life. If the story of Ben Wallace's extraordinary will has moved you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a tribute to the man who proved that perseverance can change destiny. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video with another journey about those who fought to never disappear from sports history.